Okay, look, let's make a start. Welcome to this Making Public History webinar about remembering the atomic bombs. I'm Al Thompson from Monash University, and these seminars are jointly hosted by History at Monash and the History Council of Victoria and Old Treasury Building, where in better days we'd be meeting, but we're now meeting online, given that those of us who run these seminars are all locked down in Melbourne. But welcome to those of you coming from Melbourne, from around the state, but also from around Australia and indeed overseas. We're really pleased to have you with us for this seminar. Let me start by recognising or acknowledging I'm on Wurundjeri country, and wherever we are in Australia, we're on Aboriginal land that has never been ceded. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the original Indigenous custodians of the land where all of us are, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. This Making Public History webinar obviously is a response to the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I'm delighted to be joined by Robin Gerster, Gwyn McClelland and Dimity Hawkins, who I'll introduce in a moment. But I first just want to briefly explain some technical points for those of you who are new to Zoom. Unlike Zoom, only the presenters and hosts can be seen and heard. All of you who are attending this webinar, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions at any time of any of the presenters. And we'll have 5 minutes of Q&A after each present speaker finishes, and then about 20 minutes at the end. So if you put your questions or comments there, we'll be moderating those, and then we'll be, if you like, asking your questions verbally to the speakers. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat button. If, for any of the presenters, our internet connection begins to wobble, then turn off video and just use voice. I need to let you all know that we are recording this webinar tonight, and just a reminder to Margaret and Alicia to hit record. And we're anticipating that the audio will be broadcast by ABC Radio National's Big Ideas program. So if you want to remain anonymous when you ask a question in Q&A, then you can do so. Just make a note that you are asking the question anonymously and your name won't be read out. And please, of course, keep your questions polite and respectful. So let me just briefly introduce our three presenters. Robin Gerster recently retired from Monash University, to our great sadness, Robin. Robin's the author of Travels in Atomic Sunshine, Australia and the Occupation of Japan, which was published in 2009, and also Hiroshima and Here, Reflections on Australian Atomic Culture, which is to be published by Lexington Books in the US later this year. Dr Gwyn McClelland from the University of New England has worked closely with Nagasaki survivors and is the author of a book based upon his Monash PhD, Dangerous Memory in Nagasaki, Prayers, Protests and Catholic Survivor Narratives, published by Routledge in 2019. And Dimity Hawkins AM is completing a PhD in history at Swinburne University, where she's examining resistance to nuclear weapon testing in the Pacific, particularly around independence in Fiji. Dimity is also one of the co-founders of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which, as many of you will know, was winner of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. So it's a wonderful panel. I'm Al Thompson from Monash University, and I'll be chairing the session, and my colleagues Alicia Ceretto from the History Council and Susie Prochke from History at Monash will be moderating the Q&A. So without further ado, let me pass it on. So I won't repeat the introduction to Robin. So thanks very much, Robin, and over to you. And I'll unshare this screen so you'll have the screen to yourself.
Okay. Sound okay?
All good, Robin. You go for it.
All good. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. Not so pleased to be in lockdown, but pleased to be doing this. The book to which you alluded, Hiroshima and Here, should be published next month with a bit of luck, but COVID has interfered with that along with everything else, I guess. I'll stick pretty much to the script, I think, Al, because you've sternly told me I've got 12 minutes, and if I don't, I'll go on forever. So just bear with me. I'll begin with an observation made by the American novelist William Faulkner in a speech accepting his Nobel Prize for Literature. "There are no problems of the spirit," he said. "There is only the question, when will I be blown up?" The year was 1950, just 5 years after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and at a time when the US and the Soviet Union were in intensifying competition to develop weapons even more destructive. Now, today it is difficult to believe, I think, that many people would feel the same way. The consuming fear of nuclear conflict that afflicted many of us who lived through the Cold War has been replaced by other existential anxieties. The post-Hiroshima vistas of global annihilation, Susan Sontag once observed, I think in 1988, are pockmarked with disasters, among which she included AIDS, financial crashes, overpopulation, and environmental blight and despoilation. "Apocalypse has become a long-running serial," she wrote, "not apocalypse now, but apocalypse from now on." To Sontag's list, we can now add acts of gross international terrorism, the accumulating evidence of climate change, and pandemics such as the coronavirus. Indeed, in the constant context of the calamity that is unfolding before us right now, it may seem a little self-indulgent to entertain fantasies of nuclear conflict. Yet, all-out thermonuclear war, as Daniel Ellsberg suggests in his latest book, has been a catastrophe waiting to happen for 50 years. And it's hard to believe that the luck of no destructive nuclear exchange can continue. The first Cold War may be over, but the nuclear threat remains as deadly as ever and has menacingly proliferated across the world in a new age of global instability and combustibility. If today's nuclear stockpile was reduced further or even eliminated entirely, the technology would still remain. As Margaret Thatcher said, nuclear technology can't be uninvented. I never thought I'd quote Margaret Thatcher, but there you go. So we've arrived at a time of ennui, with apocalypse lurking on the horizon, not quite real, but not quite a mirage either. So the nuclear threat remains a compelling issue for all of us, including here in Australia, a country with a long, intimate and conflicted nuclear history. In my book, I set out to explore the characteristics of Australian atomic culture. By atomic culture, I mean all those forms of cultural and political expression, production and consumption that have developed around the uses of nuclear technology. Given that the prospect of nuclear destruction is the ultimate transnational matter, it may seem a little fatuous to isolate a unique national brand of atomic culture. The threat is as real to Seoul as the people of Seoul, to the people of Sydney, to the people of Mumbai as Melbourne. Hiroshima is here wherever one lives. But perhaps the intimidating immensity of global nuclearism can be effectively tackled by examining its regional variations and how these have evolved over time. What I found in my research is a national nuclear story beset by contradiction and confusion, the story of political principle undermined by the lure of pay dirt, of bold self-assertion that degenerated into meek deference, and the pervasive sense that the nightmare of Hiroshima and Nagasaki might well happen in Australia too, sometime. Australians have occupied the nuclear space since the earliest beginnings of the atomic age. Our scientists worked on the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. Then, for several years from February 1946, thousands of Australians saw the devastation it could cause up close in the Allied occupation of post-war Japan, where they were mostly based in Hiroshima Prefecture, the ultimate military booby prize, I guess. There they lived and worked almost literally in the shadow of the bomb, to use the metaphor of the Australian Wilfred Burchett, the first Western journalist into the devastated city. Putting aside their wartime grievances, the Australians in Japan well understood their victory had come at a tremendous civilian cost and were deeply sympathetic to the survivors as they sought to rebuild their shattered lives. In this, they were at odds with the people at home, the vast majority of whom approved of the bombing as a welcome means to an end. They were also at odds with their government. Politically, post-war Australia sought to turn nuclear energy to its advantage, in part by encouraging the exploitation of its resources of the fundamental nuclear fuel, uranium, and by coming enmeshed in nuclear colonialism through its accommodation of Britain's post-war missile and testing programs, ruinously to the cost of the Indigenous communities. In the words of a government publicist, Australia wanted to become one of the big boys of the Cold War. Australia had plenty of what its powerful friends and patrons, Britain and the US, needed to realise their post-war nuclear ambitions. Uranium exploration was easily integrated into the master narrative of the pioneering conquest of an alien continent and gave meaning to an Aboriginal landscape that had seemed beyond civilisation's pale. Two irreconcilable narratives collided as they continued to collide. The nationalist narrative of European Australia, with its motifs of resource development and wealth creation, set against the Aboriginal songlines of immaterial but living presence. Both the British nuclear testing and the uranium rush entrenched Australia's place as a loyal province in the new nuclear empire. On a visit to the mine at Rum Jungle in the Northern Territory in 1956, Prince Philip was gifted a lump of local uranium resting innocently in a metal casket. It must have made a change from the stuffed koalas, but it was an appropriate gesture, for hadn't Australia already handed over vast tracts of its land to Britain for the latter to conduct its lethal nuclear experiments? Ultimately, the aspiring nuclear big boy behaved like a dutiful colonial child. During the decade since British testing ended in 1963, Australian governments have actively participated in global disarmament efforts. However, Australia's opposition to nuclear proliferation has been compromised by its unswerving support for the geopolitical defence strategies of the US. Its indignation at nuclear testing has been somewhat selective. Possessing about 1/3 of the world's uranium, Australia continues to export its nuclear resources to a volatile market. The road paved with yellowcake has become an ideological and moral minefield. Fundamental questions of both domestic and international responsibility have been clouded by the prospect of an economic bonanza. Australia likes to see itself as nuke-free, but it is an empty boast given the likelihood that our uranium has clandestinely been used in the production of nuclear weapons elsewhere, and also given that the radioactivity that emanated from the crippled reactor at Fukushima in 2011 may well have come from uranium sourced from Australia. Australia has also discreetly harboured ambitions of using its uranium riches to build a nuclear arsenal of its own, especially during periods such as the 1960s, when its historical fears of penetrative attack from the near north became especially acute. Running parallel to this surreptitious political project has been the consistent antipathy of the Australian public, which over several decades now has spawned such an effective, diverse and creative anti-nuclear protest movement. Now, this set of contradictory nuclear reactions makes for a complex cultural response. In a speech to the people for nuclear disarmament in Melbourne back in 1981, the novelist Patrick White remarked that the immense implications of nuclear warfare tempted his countrymen and women to turn their backs on the prospect. White was wrong. Australians have habitually visited and revisited Hiroshima, both as an actual city and as what John Whittier Treat calls a trope of a new fact within the human condition. They have written novels, poems, plays, historical, scientific and travel accounts about it, and they have filmed, painted and photographed it. A characteristic trait has been the relocation of Hiroshima's fate to Australia, a habit going back to August 1945, when local newspapers first reported the events in distant Japan. The front pages of major papers in state capitals transposed the devastation to maps of downtown areas of local cities. The Melbourne Argus presented the familiar street grid of the city centre, containing civic landmarks such as Flinders Street Station, calculated as certain to be laid waste by a detonation similar to that which destroyed Hiroshima. Australian cities had been placed on a frightening new nuclear map, and Hiroshima had migrated to the Australian landscape. In the decades since, Australians have shown themselves peculiarly susceptible to the contemplation of the nuclear destruction of their cities. in both scientific projections of the possibility of an approaching nuclear endgame or in fantasies of apocalypse in the far future. Often these scenarios reflect established bogies such as fears of Asian invasion, nuclear armed terrorism, and the very real fear that Australia's compliant hosting of US bases has made it a target in any future nuclear conflict. Or they are related to the social and environmental dilemmas of our age, such as institutionalised poverty, the drift to authoritarianism, waves of epidemics, and relentless climate change. So, the bombings of August 1945 are now historically distant, but they persist as a benchmark for wholesale destruction. The horrendous bushfires of early 2020 summon numerous comparisons with Hiroshima. Quote a New South Wales politician, "I've got to be honest with you, this isn't a bushfire, it's an atomic bomb." Actually, it wasn't, of course. Was this a subconscious fear of nuclear holocaust being articulated? Almost certainly not. But it might just be significant that during this dreadful time of a hunkered down city warding off a pandemic, so many people seem to have been reminded of the greatest nuclear doomsday blockbuster of them all, Neville Shoots on the Beach, a novel set in and around Melbourne, the perfect place, so it has mischievously been said, to situate the end of the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much. I'm now going to call upon my co-host, Alicia Chiretto, who's going to moderate 5 minutes of Q&A for Robin and explain how this will work. Over to you, Alicia.
Thanks, Al. So if everyone has a look down on the bottom menu bar of the screen, and you'll see a Q&A section there, and that's where you're able to type in your questions. You can put in your name, or you can choose to ask a question anonymously. And I will manage them. And typically we have more questions than we can manage, but we'll do our best to get through your questions. And while we allow everyone a bit of time to put their questions in there, Robin, I just can't get past that image of Prince Philip being offered a gift of uranium. It just sort of really sticks in the mind.
Yes, I don't know what he did with it. I suspect it didn't make it back to Buckingham Palace, but
yeah.
As I said, it makes a change from a boomerang or whatever that was habitually given.
Yes.
But, it was a matter of uranium was a source of great national pride.
Yeah.
To Australians in the early 50s. Big chunks of it were put on display in museums, and it was shown that pieces of uranium were displayed at expositions and so forth.
Yes, it's very symbolic of the attitude in the 1950s. And
well,
so
it was the resemblances to the gold rushes of the 1850s and 60s are quite significant.
And we've got a question come in here from Peter, and he says the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is now 50 years old. Are you suggesting that it is due as much to good fortune as to this treaty that we have not had nuclear war, or have we had an effective balance of terror since 1945?
I missed part of the question, Alicia, but I think
That's
I got.
Okay.
I think I got it. I think we've had a lot of luck.
Yeah, yeah.
Just searching for a reference, I did quote Ellsberg's The Doomsday Machine. He goes into quite a lot of detail about the near misses that have taken place over the last 50 years, as does the 2009 report of the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, which was co-written by Gareth Evans, the Australian politician and anti-nuclear activist. And that itemises the sort of miraculous luck of the near miracle of no nuclear exchange that has taken place over the last decades. So look, I mean, international agreements, of course, are very important, but just how important, I'm not quite sure. Certainly they're significant for people, but look at today. I mean, you know, one wonders about mischances and
Yes,
some suspicious characters in control.
Right. Yeah. And I suppose on that, Sonia's got a question asking whether you'd like to reflect on that most recent explosion in Lebanon?
Well, tremendous explosion. I have in a few days since that's taken place, I have noted the numerous references to Hiroshima and the visual evidence of the levelling of that city. As I said, Hiroshima always seems to be the reference point for these sort of visual images of mass devastation. Sometimes misses the point, I think, but yeah.
Yes.
It's a sort of convenient shorthand often, I think.
Yes, yes. Okay, so we have had a stack more questions come in, and one of them is from Ian, who says, were you able to discern any difference in attitude between those who had served and who welcomed the atomic bombs for bringing the war to an end, and those who had missed the war but were members of the BCOF as far as opinions on the bombing and general destruction of Japan was concerned?
Well, yes, look, I did a lot of work on this some years ago. The Australians are most exultant about the effectiveness of the bomb tended to be civilians. In occupied Japan itself, those most sympathetic to the Japanese tended to be those to soldiers who had fought them, including some POWs. Some of the reinforcements who supplemented the occupation force over the years were quite aggressive in their behaviour to the Japanese, and a lot of them were very young and wet behind the ears and were put in a position of power with access to guns, grog and girls, and that went to their head. By and large, the soldiers that fought the Japanese and who went on to the occupation force were amongst the most sympathetic, I found, to the Japanese. These were the original anti-nuke warriors. Some of them have retained their antipathy for nuclear weapons over the long decades since they were in Japan. So they could see what it did. Of course, people. I'm not making a moral judgment on the civilians for being happy that the war had ended and the bomb hastened that long, dreadful period, tragic period.
Yeah. And I suppose Judy follows on from that in her question, saying, to what extent was there opposition to the bombs in the first few years after they were dropped and before an anti-nuclear movement emerged? And Judy's particularly noting her memories that most women's organisations, conservative or radical, were at best ambivalent about this one.
Look, I think there was, along with the exaltation at the war being over and the sense of relief, was immediately a massive sense of disquiet. I quoted in my little talk the fact that Australian newspapers transposed maps of the devastation to Melbourne or Adelaide or Brisbane or Sydney or whatever, and saying, what next? Could this happen to us? So there was a pretty immediate sense that the world had changed. And for the first time in human history, omnicide, the total wiping out of the human race was possible. Whole cities could be destroyed with one bomb. And as the test and the American and Soviet testing proceeded apace in the first 5 years after the bombings, and testing bigger and more ruthless weapons, and this was worrying.
Yeah. Well, on that note, our questions have finished up for now, although we'll have a chance at the end to ask questions to the whole panel. So thanks, I'll pass back to Al. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you very much, Robin. We'll move on to our next speaker now. So Robin, you can mute your audio and video, and Gwyn, you can come on screen and you can put your slides up when you're ready. I will reintroduce Gwyn again for those who've joined us since the start. Gwyn is a lecturer at the University of New England who's worked closely with Nagasaki survivors and is the author of Dangerous Memory in Nagasaki, Prayers, Protests and Catholic Survivor Narratives, which is published by Routledge last year. So welcome, Gwyn, and your title, as we can see on our screen, A Catholic Narrative Out of Nagasaki, From Lament to Protest. Over to you, Gwyn, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alistair. And I'd like to just say thank you very much to the History Council of Victoria, to Monash University and the Old Treasury Building for inviting me to be a part of this, and add my deep respect to the elders of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung, and as well the Anaiwan people in the area where the University of New England is located. So I'm not going to be able to introduce you to all of the survivors who I interviewed for my book, but I've chosen to just talk about one particular survivor today. And so I've entitled it as it is because it's a story for me about how lament led to protests for the modern Catholic atomic bomb survivors, the hibakusha, they're called in Japan, where their predecessors certainly grieved, but then they tended to accept and avoid protest and just simply try to move on. And so those who are alive today were, of course, youths or children at the time of the bombing. And so I'll exemplify the movement through lament to protest by the narration of Matsuo Sachiko. And as well, she contrasts her experience with her grandmother, whose name was Nishio Waki. So let me tell you then about the 11-year-old girl named Sachiko, who lived in Urakami in the northern suburbs of Nagasaki, on the edge of Urakami Valley and alongside the river. It was 1945 and she lived in a household with 20 people, including her parents, grandparents, brother and sisters-in-law. And Sachiko's family were long-term locals in the Urakami area, and she was a part of the Catholic minority, who numbered around 12,000 people and lived mainly around the cathedral, also known as St. Mary's. This cathedral, the community was very proud of because it was the biggest cathedral in the East when it was completed in 1930. So 5 years before Sachiko was born, her grandmother and grandfather actually were in a photograph which was taken in front of the cathedral. And this photograph, in fact, memorialized an event 60 years before that, a time when thousands of Urakami villagers were exiled around Japan. So in this photograph, there's maybe 35 or 40 returnees, and they wear their black kimonos and they are arranged in front of the cathedral. Kimonos with family crests as well. So Sachiko described to me her family horse and cart business started by her great-grandfather after the family's return to Nagasaki from exile. And they were model citizens. After that time, the family managed up to 8 horse carriages and employed live-in employees, and they were located around 600 to 700 metres from what would become the hypocenter of the atomic bombing. Most likely the family was not rich, but Sachiko nonetheless remembered life as before the bombing as rich, with abundant vegetable and rice fields around their house where they lived with the many children. But if we go back earlier in time, Sachiko's ancestors were a part of what historians have called the Christian century of Japan, when the Jesuit missionaries from Spain and Portugal arrived, and then various orders and the mendicants arrived to missionize. And there were accompanying traders who brought goods and swapped them for silver, and even took slaves to make their fortunes out of Japan. So for a short period, Nagasaki city itself was a Christian city. It was even called by some the Rome of the Orient, until Hideyoshi and then later the Tokugawa shoguns shut down Christianity, and they forced most of the Europeans out of the islands of Japan. And so thousands of the Christians apostatized, but some of these apostates found new ways to hide their faith or to carry on secret societies and to hold on some semblance of the practices which they had held. So Sachiko's grandparents were among the groups who had kept such practices to themselves over the centuries. And when the Paris Missionary Society arrived in Japan in the second half of the 19th century, many of them attempted to rejoin Catholicism. And that's when that persecution occurred, which led to the exile of this group of people. And the shogun first, and then the Meiji state, forced them to be transported to many other places around Japan. So the first thing that Sachiko told me when we had an interview, which was held in the Atomic Bomb Museum Cafe in Nagasaki, was about her grandparents and particularly about her grandmother. She remembered her grandmother fondly. She died prior to 1945, but she became not just a survivor of the exile, but a double survivor. Having survived as a child, she went on to survive the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. And so for Sachiko, if her grandmother could survive this persecution initially and then the atomic bomb, then surely Sachiko also could get through the trials of the atomic bombing. So she said, if they can do their best and live on, then I can endure. And Sachiko told me that the reason that she and her grandmother survived anyway was her father's foresight. Her father had heard rumours of a new weapon or bombing raids which were set to occur. And so he built a shack up on the hill. And this is where the family went to seek safety. And in my interviews, this was the only family that this was the case. But unfortunately for him, he had a duty to be at a watchtower next morning. And so he was fatally wounded and he died by the 28th of August. So on 9th August at 1945, at 11:02 a.m., due to the cloud cover limiting visibility and the lack of fuel, the pilots eventually released a bomb not above the original Nagasaki target, but slightly earlier. So the bomb exploded above the Urakami Valley, north of the city, and it exerted 22,000 tons of TNT equivalent, which is compared to 12,500 tons of TNT equivalent in Hiroshima 3 days earlier. And so the casualties were found even further from the hypocenter compared to Hiroshima, but they were caught up in the valley. And so, so there was still protection due to the hills of some suburbs of the city. So as a result, the recovery from the destruction was highly differentiated in Nagasaki's case. And by late 1945, there was a newspaper reporting that people on one side of Nagasaki city were rejoicing and dancing in a shrine okunchi festival. And others on the other side, in Urakami itself, probably and possibly including Sachiko herself, were mourning at the church. Because it was 8,500 of the Catholic community of 12,000 that were said to have been killed in the bombing. So over 70% of the community. And the cathedral, which was the center of faith practice for the community, was demolished, killing those inside. And on last Sunday, if you did see Nagasaki Day, the ceremony online, there was a survivor who is a narrator in my book as well, Fukuhori Shigemi, who spoke as a representative at the memorial service. And he himself lived right alongside the cathedral. But Sachiko lamented the cathedral's destruction, and she said it was a fujiyu na omoi, a crippling memory, a profound negative. And in the aftermath, she said she didn't want to return home. She talked of those who had died. I felt like their spirits were all around me, and I didn't want to be around our house because that was where they died. And on top of the deaths of 8 family members, including 2 younger brothers, 2 elder brothers, an older sister, a sister-in-law, and 2 aunts, Sachiko's family were left destitute, and their belongings and their business was all gone. She didn't return to school until the following year, and she said she was ashamed to go back because she had no shoes. She was barefoot. There was no special assistance for atomic bomb victims before 1957, and Sachiko remembered the accusations that she had germs. So she went to the mountains with her family to find food, and they grew what they could in the paddocks. But her grandmother just tended to say, let's move on, let's not hold grudges. She said, my grandma didn't hold a grudge against America. And she quoted Nishio Waki, her grandmother, in a humorous tone. She said, this world we live in is given to us by God. We live here by God's grace. But, and then in an aside, she said to me, angry people were still angry. And then she laughed. Sachiko also had very strong memories of the bodies in the landscape of Urakami after the bombing. And in this, I think sensate memory overpowers the narrative for her. Her fragmentary sense of memory is probably due to her state of shock induced by the experiences, but two bodies, a mother and a child, exemplified the challenging scenes for her. She said they were burying the bodies and burning them, and there was a terrible smell. Amidst the bones of many dead bodies, I could see a perished baby inside the womb of a dead mother. It stayed like that for a long time, and I can't forget the condition of that baby. So Sachiko was haunted by this image of an unborn baby and his or her mother, representative of the bomb's indiscriminate killing of all people, regardless of age, gender, or status. The killing of the pregnant mother encapsulated the destruction of the bombing to the 80-year-old Sachiko when she was speaking with me, and her memory of when she was 11. But she also lamented the social exclusion of the atomic bomb survivors and how this visited upon the next generation as well. When the time came for her daughter to be married, she said, the family of the groom almost pulled out because they were questioning the danger of the lingering irradiation which might be passed on through the generations for any children to come. And she also said the bomb was spoken of as an Urakami bombing until the time that compensation was paid out. And after this, it became a Nagasaki bombing. And when I asked her about the saying, Nagasaki is prayer, Hiroshima anger, which is a common one in Japan, Sachiko's response was the opposite of her grandmother's. She protested, we are angry. All of us, everyone is angry. Never let this kind of thing again occur. I don't think the United States has understood yet the impact of the radiation. Using a lot of atomic power, the air is dirty. Radiation and living in amongst the radiation is not right. For the hibakusha, for the survivors, the pain continues and they are disappearing. This feeling is still strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwyn. Thank you very much. I'm just going to reintroduce Alicia Chiretto, who will be moderating 5 minutes of Q&A in response to Gwyn's presentation.
Thanks, Al, and thanks, Gwyn. I think that's been, again, another really, you know, those visions and images that stayed with Sachiko, but I think will stay with us as an audience too. And if I can invite everyone to continue to use the Q&A in the lower menu bar, just to put in any of your questions. And while we give everyone a chance to do that, Gwyn, I was really struck by your point, of course, that the people you've interviewed are children. And did you explore that idea of children's memories and how that impacts the telling of those stories many years later?
Yes, I did. I think, you know, people's question often is, well, children's memories, they're not necessarily worth as much as people who've, you know, had a chance to properly understand what's going on. But I think when it comes to this kind of trauma and this kind of event, that you know, there's a lot of evidence that children's memory is quite powerful, and also that the time that's been since the event, they've had a chance to think it through, to add a lot of historical understanding to what they know, and to develop and to compose their memories, and so so it can actually still be well it is quite important and important for our understanding of what happened. I think it's not to be dismissed.
Oh, definitely, yes. And overlaying their adult, as they grow and become an adult, overlaying their childhood experience with their adult knowledge, I think must have been very powerful for you to hear those stories.
Yeah.
So we've got a few questions that have come through, and just looking, John says, how did the Americans attempt to justify the unjustifiable second bomb?
Okay, so, you know, I think this is an interesting one, really. I suppose that from what I've looked at in terms of the the leaders who were making the decision about, dropping a second atomic bomb, this happened very, very fast. And so the United States had 3 days between the two. They were implementing a plan, I think, to some degree. But then, of course, Nagasaki only came into it very, very late in the piece. So they had a whole list of certain targets for an atomic bombing. And I think Kyoto was included at one stage, and they decided against that for certain reasons. And then Kokura was really the one that the aeroplane was setting out for on the day. And so, as I said, it was inclement weather that ended up meaning that Nagasaki had the atomic bomb dropped on it. And I think Truman himself sort of believed or somehow convinced himself that this was a target that was military, completely military. And so I think that, that's as much as I could probably say about that, because it's not the focus of my studies. But yeah.
There's a question here from Olivia who said, did you encounter many citizens of Nagasaki who want the US to apologise for the bombings, or were hurt by Obama only visiting Hiroshima in 2016?
Okay, I think the point that Nagasaki is neglected is an important one, and this is very, very much felt within Japan and for Nagasaki citizens in particular. So, what was the first part of your question again, Alicia?
It was around, were there many citizens who wanted the US to apologise for the bombings, was the first part.
I specifically asked the survivors who I spoke to, so I spoke with 12 different survivors, about their feelings about whether they, how they felt about forgiving the atomic bomb, whether there was ever a time for that, or how did they feel about the United States and the action of the bombing. And certainly it's a little bit of a mixed reaction. So there's a bit of a spectrum, but there's a very strong feeling that the leaders who caused this to happen, some kind of apology is needed, but there is still a space for that. And so I'm sure with Obama's visit that was there was a feeling of neglect in a sense. My study was also of the Catholic community, and so the first Pope to visit Nagasaki, he went in 1981, and that was Pope John Paul II. And he first went to Hiroshima, as was generally what happened. But last year when Pope Francis visited, he came to Nagasaki first, and the community remembers that. That's one of the first things that they often mention to me, or that I've noticed that they say. Yeah.
And someone's asked here, there was a sense that Nagasaki was chosen because it had a substantial Christian population, and whether you think that there was any foundation to that?
I've never found any connection to the Christian population being a reason for dropping the bomb. Actually, I think it's quite embarrassing for the United States. I think that seeing as United States perceived themselves to be a Christian country in terms of the war that was happening, that it wouldn't have been their aim to drop the bomb on the largest Catholic community in Japan at the time. So it's one of the reasons that I called my book Dangerous Memory in Nagasaki, because I think it's kind of a dangerous memory, which is for the United States, it's something that maybe that is a bit uncomfortable.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That's our last question for now, and I'm sure Al's coming back to us to introduce the next speaker. Thank you, Gwyn, and thanks everyone for your questions.
Thank you both very much. And while Dimity brings her screen and audio back, let me just reintroduce Dimity for those who've joined the session since we began. Dimity Hawkins AM is completing her PhD in history at Swinburne University in Melbourne, which is examining resistance to nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific, particularly around independence in Fiji. She's also one of the co-founders of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which many of you know was winner of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. And Dimity's talk, and I should have shared the screen, but I've forgotten to do so, is called Glowing Skies, Burning Sands, Nuclear Testing in the Pacific. Over to you, Dimity.
Thanks so much, Alistair. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a real honour. And thank you to Robin and Gwyn for your really moving stories and accounts about the testing story and the nuclear use story so far. Like the others, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking tonight from Naarm in Melbourne, the land of Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. As this event is focused on the nuclear story, I also pay my respects to the other elders tonight, the Hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors of Japan, and to Aboriginal and Islander elders across the region who were subjected to nuclear weapons manufacturing, testing, and waste. As we mark the passing of the 75th anniversaries of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the first ever nuclear test, Trinity, it has been a time of deep reflection and commemoration. For many of us involved in this work, it is the voices and stories of the Hibakusha and other survivors who have led our campaigns to drive nuclear disarmament and seek nuclear justice. But it's also vital to remember that Nagasaki was far from the last place bombed. The last city, yes. The last place, unfortunately, no. Those bombings in Japan in 1945 triggered a spiraling escalation of a new arms race and started a testing frenzy that was to affect our region very deeply. The Pacific was used by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France as testing grounds for the development of their nuclear arsenals. Between 1946, just a year after the bombing of Nagasaki, to 1996, the Marshall Islands, Australia, Johnson Atoll, Christmas and Malden Islands, now part of Kiribati, and Mohi Nui, or French Polynesia, saw over 300 nuclear tests conducted. And in the context of a very, very Cold War, it is important to recognize that this was done not by declared enemies, but by supposed friends, colonial masters, or occupiers, depending on your perspective. The Marshall Islands alone estimate that the American nuclear testing there equated to 1.6 Hiroshima-sized bombs every day for 12 years. Common to all three nuclear weapons testing states was the justification that these places were remote or unpopulated or empty. But these places are not far away when they are your home. It is not far away when your ancestors have lived there for beyond time, when it is your food, your water, your elders, or your children being affected. This erasure of people and places through such unseeing myths was fed by racist presumptions and prejudices. Evidence that these people and places mattered very little, if at all, in the calculations of the nuclear states. The great Pacific writer Epele Hau'ofa described this region as a sea of islands, not simply islands in a sea. Ratuso Kamisasemara, the first Prime Minister of Fiji, described the Pacific as our aquatic continent. The sense that the unity of the Oceania also brings with it a sense of regional identity and, by extension, of responsibility. The nuclear testing issue solidified that in the last half of last century more than almost any other issue for the Pacific, particularly in relation to independence and decolonization movements. The story of nuclear resistance in the Pacific is too often marginalized by the dominance of justifications from nuclear ambitious metropolitan states. Claims of harm to health and environment have been met with obfuscation and denial, or tied up in state or military secrecy. The tests were rationalized away against flawed concepts such as nuclear deterrence. In academia, too often the first-hand stories of our region have been reduced to a footnote, or indeed missing entirely. My current project is working through archives and oral histories to identify the responses of Fiji to the nuclear testing threat at around the time of independence there. So for Fiji, which gained independence 50 years ago this October, nuclear histories coalesced in a number of ways. One of the earliest was the role played by the Fijian military personnel in Britain's nuclear tests on Christmas and Malden Islands in 1957 and 58. A dozen initial tests were conducted in Australia before Britain turned to the Northern Pacific, as Robin was saying earlier. Fijian troops joined British and New Zealand military and scientific personnel and Gilbertese labourers to participate in the next stage of the UK weapons testing programme. Fiji was still a colony of the UK, and the Fijian troops were under British command. They took part in 9 nuclear tests, including the largest thermonuclear tests ever conducted by the British. Many of the personnel were involved in multiple tests. Researchers have found evidence that the troops were placed in hazardous positions. One of the veterans that I've had the honour of interviewing was Levani Nwanga, and he witnessed a number of explosions in his time on Christmas Island. Levani described the blasts as bright as arc welding over 1,000 field was set on fire. Like so many veterans, Levani insists that he and other Fijians were never informed or gave their consent for the operations they took part in. Levani explained that he remained silent initially out of loyalty to Great Britain and military honour, but he's no longer silent. There are complex reasons for silence imposed on the veterans, including perhaps the trauma that they went through, and cultural elements, such as adherence to chiefly and military authority. Andy Sivo has worked as a legal representative with veterans and their families to seek compensation for the British. Andy Sivo has strong family history with the testing and its impacts. She's the daughter of Sir Ratu Sir Panaya Ganilau, the High Chief, the political leader, former military commander of Fiji's battalion, and later Governor General, and then First President of Fiji. Ratu Panaya went to visit one of the first of the tests conducted by the British on the Christmas Island. He later suffered great illness and died of leukemia. Like many nuclear veterans from other countries, Fijian personnel are still seeking recognition of the harm that they suffered from the tests. The secrecy that the military personnel were expected to adhere to on return home meant that for many it was not until decades later that they realized their health problems were linked not simply to misfortune, but to the effect of the bombs. For Fijian nuclear veterans, acknowledgement of responsibility, apology, and compensation are central to their claims for justice. To date, however, there has been no compensation from the British or recognition of the harm done in the Pacific testing grounds. For tonight's webinar, Andy Sivo generously offered me a Fijian word that summarizes how Fijian veterans and families feel about their nuclear testing experience, but also the broader Pacific experience of nuclear testing. That word is Vail Vakalolo Mataki, which she explains means the end result of traumatic action imposed by the powerful on the weak. Andy Sivo uses this profound Fijian word, as she says it encompasses the meaning of all the following which can be attributed to the Christmas Islands experience: deception, oppression, abuse, slavery, blackbirding, despair, hopelessness, the destruction of environment, humanity, dignity, a generational extermination of a race of people. Ultimately, Andy Sivo explains, the experience is one of injustice of a mega-nuclear proportions. In January 2015, the Fijian Prime Minister, Frank Bainimarama, himself the son of a nuclear veteran, announced that nuclear veterans and their families would receive a grant from the government. It is important to understand that these were not made as compensation, as that is the responsibility of Britain. But these grants were a gesture of support for veterans and their families from their government. Prime Minister Bainimarama described the treatment of veterans as a blight on our history, saying we need to lift the burden on our collective conscience. So, while Fiji was never directly subjected to testing on its territories, a vibrant civil society movement was formed there immediately before and post-independence. This helped kick off one of this region's most compelling and lasting protest movements, the Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific movement. From that time, the Pacific People's Charter for a Nuclear-Free and Independent Pacific was first proposed in Fiji, and it states at its very beginning, "We, the people of the Pacific, have been victimized too long by foreign powers. The Western imperialist and colonial powers invaded our defenseless region, took our lands and subjugated our people to their whims. Our environment continues to be despoiled by foreign powers developing nuclear weapons for a strategy of warfare that has no winners, no liberators, and imperils the survival of humankind." For this region, then, so deeply affected by nuclear weapons testing, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons offers significant opportunities to reveal, rectify, and remediate past wrongs, and to address very present and persistent problems. This treaty, which was adopted in the United Nations in 2017 by 122 countries, now has 82 signatories and 44 of the 50 ratifications it requires to see this treaty enter into force. Understanding the history of nuclear testing in the Pacific can help clarify and identify regional claims to assistance and reparation. So just this past weekend, 4 states had deposited instruments of ratification, signaling that in their official statements, a dedication to the memories of those who died in that very first use of nuclear weapons 75 years ago. Today, there are an estimated 14,000 nuclear weapons in the arsenals of 9 nations. Given this ongoing nuclear possession and the renewal of nuclear arsenals by nuclear states, as well as the degradation of established multilateral disarmament infrastructure, understanding the impact of past nuclear use and testing is important. We can't afford for this to continue or ever to happen again. So in conclusion, I've heard from many Hibakusha, both of the first and the second generations, of a sense of urgency in capturing and recording their stories and registering their protests so that future generations will know the reality of the use of nuclear weapons. For the Pacific, the same urgency applies. This is the work of the Hibakusha and nuclear survivors of all of these events, of activist allies and disarmament experts. It is the work of all affected nations, and this is the work of historians, and oral historians particularly. I believe that this is the work we must do, not purely as an academic exercise, but as a duty to humanity, to honor those who lost their lives, to preserve the stories of those who survived, and to inform all our descendants who carry these legacies of these atrocities. In remembering the nuclear bombings in all their forms and across all their places, we must also commit to ensuring that these tragedies are never repeated. Vinaka, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dimity. I'm now going to just pass it over to our colleague Alicia, who will moderate 5 minutes of Q&A with Dimity before we open up to a longer Q&A with all 3 speakers.
Thanks.
Thanks, Al, and thanks, Dimity, for such a powerful talk, reflecting and honouring, I think, so these veterans that you've been working with and working alongside.
Well, I haven't so much been working with the veterans. I was very fortunate to interview one, but most of the people I've been working with are from a later period. It was just, I was very fortunate. I am very fortunate to have those contacts with Undisivo and some of the Veterans Association people. But yeah, they're a big part of the backstory of nuclear in
Yeah, very good. If I can invite everyone once again to use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to ask any questions of Dimity that you have, and I'll pass them on. I particularly sort of felt like you were using such strong words, the idea of silences, of trauma, injustice, and then to move to that idea of treaty and those sort of really active active ways of dealing with the past, as well as your mention of historians and oral historians in helping tell this story and spread this story, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that there's a real role for that at the moment. I mean, it's important not to speak on behalf of the people who are affected, but it's also important to be good allies in this way and this is something that historians can certainly do, is to try and, you know, make sure that there's not a continued erasure, which is such a feature of nuclear colonialism in particular. You know, that there is an erasure of these voices, of these stories, of these people. So seeking those out, making sure that there is space created for those voices to be heard, for those stories to be recorded, and to make sure that they are featured and that there's space for them is really important. And I think that goes across academia, but I think in history in particular that we have a burden there to pick up and take, because it's been very unequal so far.
Yes. We've had a few questions come through, and one of them from Damien talks about the Indigenous relationship to the land. So here saying, in many Indigenous communities around Oceania, the land itself is seen as possessing agency and being actively inhabited and manipulated by the ancestors. Is a similar notion held by local Fijian communities? And if so, how has the nuclear weapons testing affected their view of the land and their ancestors?
Well, as I am not an Indigenous Fijian person myself, I grew up there, I spent some of my childhood there, but I would hesitate to speak on behalf of those people. But what I do know is that in Fiji, Vanua, so land, is very central to the Fijian people and their sense of importance of that land, and so oceans as well, and even the skies. All of this is one part. So there's definitely a strong story about that. I think across the Pacific, and this is what my research has found, across the Pacific, you saw such a sense, like I said in my little talk, about the unity of the Pacific. So the nature of nuclear weapons, the nature of these sorts of tests that happened across the Pacific, is that it doesn't sort of sit neatly in the lines of these, the maps that are drawn up by the nuclear testing states. Here's where the fallout will be, and that's how it's going to be. The sense across the Pacific was very much a shared harm that came about. It was shared through the waters, it was shared through the food sources, it was shared through the fish. It was shared because we're all part of one great aquatic continent, if you want to use Dr. Mara's sense. And I think that that is an important thing. As I say, I can't speak on behalf of Fijians per se, but what I do know is that that's a very common sense that you hear from a lot of people throughout the Pacific, that sense that we are all part of one thing here. And I think that, you know, the science bears that out as well.
And I suppose looking at some of our other questions, Sonia said, as you were talking, she was reminded of the attack on the Rainbow Warrior in New Zealand. And people were outraged about that, but not so much about nuclear testing. And can you provide your thoughts on that image?
Yeah, well, that was an atrocious attack on a peaceful, a peaceful project, basically, and indeed took lives. And there was a lot that was never sort of fully dealt with in that whole attack. But in terms of not being so protesting against the tests themselves, I don't think that is true at all. In fact, the tests began, as I said, just a year, not even a year actually, after the bombing of Nagasaki. And those tests went right through to 1996, so 46 to 96, 50 years. And you'll see throughout that time, there were huge protests here in Melbourne, in Naarm. There were massive protests, but right throughout the Pacific and indeed right throughout the world, there were protests, even before countries gained their independence. And that's really important to remember here, that many of the Pacific nations were still under colonial control right up until certainly up until the mid-1960s. Many of them, Fiji was one of the earliest to gain its independence. Fiji was also the first of the Pacific nations to gain a seat at the United Nations in 1970. You know, it's all pretty recent in history. So even amongst all of that, we still saw Pacific nations standing up and speaking out. We saw people, you know, building these protest movements even before they had their own independence. And this is where that nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement became so powerful, because it combined those two things together. One of the other people I interviewed for my thesis was the former Deputy Prime Minister of Fiji. And she was saying that it was actually, she was saying, Taufa Avakatali, sorry, she was saying that it was actually, for them, that nuclear testing was colonialism. And that sort of, that relationship between nuclear testing and colonialism was really strong. And that was said over and over again by the people that I interviewed as well. So I think that it would be, yes, it mustn't be forgotten how strongly those protests happened. The sorts of things you see nowadays with the protests around climate change, for example, we saw those, you know, 40, 50 years ago as well. Certainly, you know, we will probably have to see some of that again, unfortunately, because the nuclear states continue to hold on to their nuclear weapons.
Yes. Thank you, Dimity. We've run out of time, but I'm going to hand over to Al as we go back to the whole group. Thanks.
Thank you, Dimity, and please stay with us. And can I invite Gwyn and Robin to come back by unmuting your audio and unmuting your video, and also invite my Monash History colleague, Susie Prochke, to join us. Susie's now going to moderate. We've got about just over 20 minutes for a Q&A to the whole panel. So over to you, Susie.
Thank you, Al, and thank you to all three of our speakers. I'm still waiting for some comments to come in, but I guess the first one that I'll kind of throw out to you is we've had John make a comment about Aboriginal elders, the Kazakhs, the Navajo Nation. I think, you know, if we want to broaden this out, there is a very widespread experience of nuclear contamination, which begins with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, goes through kind of civilian uses of energy. Some of us can remember Chernobyl, and then goes through nuclear testing in the Pacific. So there is actually a global experience of exposure to nuclear contamination. And I wonder if you panelists would like to comment on that. What makes these experiences unique historically and culturally, and what makes them global, and perhaps talk about experience as well as protest.
I could say something to kick it off.
Sure.
As I come to this area from a slightly different angle. I'm basically a literary cultural studies person. So in looking at Australian atomic culture, I tried to see resemblances to others. If you're going to say something is distinctive, then you're going to say why. But it struck me that Australian atomic culture has a lot of resemblance to that of the US, largely because of two things: the exploitation of native land for uranium in New Mexico to feed the insatiable appetite of the weapons program in the US, the Manhattan Project and after, and the use of native land in Nevada for their infamous testing site, which conducted a stupendous amount of nuclear testing over many, many years. So I saw great resemblances between Australia and the US in that specific aspect. The one difference being, I suppose, that in America's case, I guess the US was doing it on its own behalf, and in Australia's case, we entered a process of kind of double colonialism, if you will, where we enacted missile and weapons testing and conducted mass uranium mining, and have done so on native land, largely at the behest of Britain in the first instance, and to serve other countries latterly. So that's one significant difference. But I found a large resemblance between the US and Australia in that specific respect of nuclear colonialism.
I could make one comment if you like as well. I think, you know, last year I was pretty surprised when one of our senior international relations experts at ANU said, maybe Australia needs to consider getting nuclear weapons ourselves. And so to me, you know, this is one of the things that I, you know, in terms of an insecure environment at the moment, and it seemed to be still kind of a fear, which is going back to the fear of Japan, I think originally, but then it switched to China, and then that was one thing that worried me, but.
I think it's definitely on the agenda. I mean, read Hugh White's How to Defend Australia, and came out last year. It's not actually suggesting Australia should have nuclear weapons, but that in such a febrile atmosphere as we're existing in at the moment, then it's the option, if that's the right word, is lurking in the minds of.
No, Robin, not if we can help it, mate.
That's true. That's true. I'm not advocating. I don't think Hugh White's advocating it either, to be fair to him. But,
but at the same time, I noticed as well there's a Lowy poll out just recently, and it said that the young people from, I think it was 18 to 25, actually respect their greatest security respect is to Japan. And I thought that's possibly a bit misguided, because if you saw the Nagasaki ceremony on Sunday, then there was Abe, and there was the mayor of Nagasaki asking him to take on the treaty, and you know, Abe was ignoring that and, you know, being careful about that. So I don't think Japan's going to take on the nuclear weapon ban at this stage either.
No, they're not looking too likely to do that. That's true. Going back to, we could talk a lot about whether or not it's likely that Australia would ever get nuclear weapons. I think, as you know, and as you said, Robin, you know, the 1960s, they had a fair tilt at it. It's not going to happen as far as we're concerned. And it's partly not going to happen because we're making such great leaps and bounds with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which we've only got 6 signatories to go before that treaty comes into force, and it will make illegal once and for all nuclear weapons. Of course, there's a whole lot of complexities with that. But going back to what John asked earlier in the questioning, he was asking about, you know, the multitude of places in which testing has taken place. It's absolutely right. Here in the Pacific, as I said, 315 or so tests. But around the world, between 1945 and 1996, there were over 2,000 nuclear tests taken. So huge amounts. The reason I focus on the Pacific is because this is where I am. I'm a child of the Pacific. I grew up here. This is where I have my focus. And again, as I said before, it is a history that's not well known, and it's not well known enough within the region and outside of the region any longer. And it needs to be brought back into focus. And it particularly needs to be because there will be a time where there will be the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons will be looking at victim assistance and environmental remediation, and it will do so for test survivors as well as Hiroshima. So this is an important thing for us to sort of be focusing on. But yeah, so there are many places in which these things happened. But for the British, for the French, and for the United States, all of their largest nuclear weapons tests, all their large atmospheric nuclear weapons tests took place in the Pacific. So, you know, it does have a very strong role, and a strong level of accountability needs to be taken about that.
So that takes us to a question from JD Mittman, who says, thanks to all panelists for drawing together the different threads of nuclear history in the wider region. Considering Australia's central role as exporter of uranium, as testing ground, a supporter of nuclear deterrence strategies as Pacific country, what are Australia's moral obligations from your point of view? I'm not sure moral obligations to who, but I guess to ourselves and our neighbours in the Pacific, I imagine.
I might handball that.
I think we should possibly start with you, Timothy.
Morality is not my strong suit.
Morality is always a tricky one, isn't it? I think that the point is that we do have a really strong role to play. You know, Australia has played a strong role, both as it is pointed out again and again, because we have about a third of the world's known recoverable uranium resources, and we've been exporting those all of this time. We also have been that, you know, we have been on the receiving end of the British nuclear testing, 12 major nuclear tests done here in Australia in the 1950s, and about 600 or so nuclear and radiological and toxic tests that were run throughout that time up to 1963, which were helping to develop the British nuclear weapons. So we do have that first-hand experience, and that first-hand experience had particular impacts on Indigenous communities here in Australia. So there's a huge obligation within Australia to understand that history and to hear directly from the survivors of that as well, I think. But we also need to look within our region as well, especially right now when we still have such a problem with nuclear weapons. I was smiling a lot, Robin, in your beginning, where you were talking about you know, that it's maybe a little bit too much to be thinking about nuclear weapons when we've got so many other pressing needs right now. But the reality is that these weapons are so devastating and so dangerous, and they're still so prevalent. They're able to, there's thousands of them on hair trigger alert, able to be launched within seconds, within minutes anyway, sorry, at the moment in the world. And so there really are huge problems with that.
We're definitely in an age of complacency about the nuclear threat, no doubt about it. Partly because there are so many other damn things to worry about, I guess, which are
well, this one's a bit of a you know, one afternoon kind of threat, isn't it? So I guess there's a lot of problems there. But I think also, you know, Australia in particular, if we're talking about Australia specifically, you know, our government has tied our fortunes to the American nuclear ability. So we've tied our security to America's nuclear weapons, and we mustn't do that. We can't afford to do that. It's not something that will work. It's not something that we can, you know, hiding under a nuclear umbrella that's offered by the United States is not a way to deal with the kinds of challenges that we face in our region or in the world at the moment, is what I would say.
Can I push you both, Gwyn and Robin, to sort of to come in on this question of I guess obligations? What are historians good for here? I think a common theme that comes out of research in this area is the particular role of oral history as a counterpoint to other kinds of sources and archives that either are silent or incomplete. You know, so we have official and military archives that are either not released to the public, or that, you know, that don't speak to the experiences of people who've been exposed to nuclear contamination. But also the scientific record is incomplete and kind of silent, because there are just not enough longitudinal studies on the impacts of testing and civilian exposure to nuclear contamination. So what is the role of historians here? Now, Gwyn, you've done oral history, and, you know, there are lots of different sort of sources here that we can talk about, but, you know, on the question of morality and obligation.
I mean, I think it relates to me to the questions around silence and trauma, and, you know, that for the Catholic community in Nagasaki, there was many reasons that they didn't say anything for a long time, and so therefore the historian has to, when it's time, when the people are ready to speak about it, be ready to listen to the stories. I think Dimity's made that point already, but so for the Catholics after the bombing, I know that the cathedral became a bit of a debate whether to reconstruct it or not, because some people wanted to hold it as an icon of to remember the atomic bombing, but many of the Catholics actually wanted to rebuild it because this was actually a symbol for them of misery. And another example, Mary, the icon of Mary, there's a destroyed statue, and it's a Mary statue. And so even if the survivors at some stages are not ready to speak about what's happened, they're still using symbols and dealing with trauma in other ways. So I saw another question, which was, how do the survivors deal with their trauma? And I think what I found was, for the people who I was talking to, it was by talking, telling their stories, but being listened to. And so the listener also has a role in that, but also by becoming involved in peace activities and by protesting. I think the protest is also a part of it. So anyway, I've said enough, Robin.
Well, look, as I said earlier, I come from a literary cultural studies background, so I guess I tend to look at representation, the way things are talked about and spoken about and consumed. And in this case, what Hiroshima stands for. It's just struck me as we've been talking that also that in my work I looked at the atomic energy in its totality, and when we think about nuclear power, we tend to automatically think of weapons, and so there are other applications, obviously, to nuclear energy, medical, industrial, agricultural, energy applications. And in Australia's case, so not only in Australia but elsewhere, there was in not only scientific quarters but domestic quarters some genuine excitement in the late 1940s about the applications of nuclear energy, and these have gone on in the decades since. So I look at some of those elements to this issue in popular culture and popular music as well.
So that's interesting, because even in a course which we were teaching, we were weighing up, so nuclear energy or not. So nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, you know, for my students, it was actually a very difficult question.
It is a difficult question.
Yeah, so thank you, Gwyn. You're doing a great job helping me with these discussions. We actually have a question from Peter. Would any of the speakers like to comment on attitudes to the peaceful use of nuclear energy, both in Australia and internationally?
Gwyn.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Fukushima, Robin, and I think after Fukushima, after Chernobyl, after New York, the Mile Island, 3 Mile Island, sorry. You know, there's all these examples where it goes wrong. So I wonder why Germany has decided to try to move right away from nuclear energy, and I believe that's still the case. So well,
they are buying a lot of it from France, however. So France is cleaning up in that respect.
Okay.
But cleaning up being the operative word, I think. But yeah.
And maybe this, sorry, Susie.
Definitely on the table in Australia. I mean, it's as one element in the energy mix, there's no doubt about it.
I think that there are so many
political hot potato. I noticed Scott Morrison did mention it in the last election campaign. He seemed to suggest he was open to the idea of nuclear power plants, and when this was made more overt, he quickly backtracked because it's dynamite. But it is an issue has been supported. I mean, Gareth Evans himself has suggested that nuclear energy may be useful as a an antidote to climate change. But so
I think that there's a lot of people who want to keep bringing this idea up and up and up and up and up. However, I think that we have such amazing alternatives to nuclear nowadays. And I think that that old technology, which is deeply flawed, which is really problematic, which has incredible legacies of waste that are really hard to deal with. And we know that because all around the world, since they first started using nuclear power, we've seen an enormous amount of nuclear waste build up, and certainly Fukushima is an example of where these things can go so terribly, terribly wrong. So I think that we've got so many other alternatives nowadays. I mean, does nuclear power work? Yes, it does, but it's a very silly way to boil a kettle when you think about the risks and the long-term legacies, right? We have an abundance in this country of all sorts of ways in which we can create energy and use energy. Solar and wave power and hydropower, all sorts of different ways of doing it. Nuclear is just the least feasible option, and it's certainly not a popular one. And because of its links to nuclear weapons, it is really one that will be consistently contested into the future.
I agree with you.
So we've got 1 minute, and I'm going to exercise, I don't know what I am right now, some kind of chair's privilege, to ask you, should we have historians and anthropologists in institutions like ANSTO and in scientific institutions that kind of conduct research on the uses of nuclear energy and sort of similar institutions?
Well, if I may start with that one, I think that we will need to, in some senses, have a very strong look at histories, as I've said before, because of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That treaty, of course, is based around humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. And because it is, we need to sort of look at those humanitarian impacts. We need to understand what those are. And like I said before, seek out those stories, seek out those testimonies, seek out the lived experience. So I think that historians could very easily play a role in that way. And I think that, you know, because of the longevity of nuclear, whether you're talking about power, whether you're talking about medicine, whether you're talking about any of those sorts of things, there is a longevity, you know, intergenerational longevity around this material. So therefore, historians will need to understand where it comes from and where it goes to. That's going to be really important.
I personally, as a historian, I think that historians bring a lot to the discussion. So I would love to see them valued and, you know, a part of policy making in that sense. So I see it as a really good positive thing to do.
Have to agree with that, although they do say that, you know, get 6 academics and they can't change a light bulb, but I'm sure that they could help some scientific boffins do their job a bit better.
Lovely, thank you all. And I'm sure Robin would probably want to add literature and culture is important as well as history. Although whether you'll get a literature...
Well, I see them as pretty much the same, literary history, whatever, cultural history.
Absolutely.
Right. Look, thank you all. Before we finish up and before I thank presenters one more time, I just want to share my screen and make 2 concluding announcements. Firstly, Monash University Publishing is one of the sponsors for the Making Public History seminars. So I'm delighted to say that there are books in the post, and the post isn't as fast as it might otherwise be in lockdown Melbourne, but there are books from Monash University Publishing in the post to each of our 3 presenters. So thanks to MUP.
Thank you very much
for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And also just to let you know that the next Making Public History seminar is on the 10th of November. A panel of eminent speakers talking about Victoria's native vegetation history, heritage and politics. And so if you'd like to come along to that, then you can find the details on the History Council of Victoria website. And it remains for me to thank all of the participants. I think we had about 125 when I counted at peak. Thank you all of our attendees for coming along and joining this webinar. And thank you so much to Robin Gerster, Gwyn McClelland and Dimity Hawkins for 3 terrific presentations and for a really stimulating Q&A. And thank you also to my co-hosts from the History Council, Margaret Bertley and Alicia Ceretto, and from Monash History, Susie Prochke. Thank you all and good night. And those of you who are returning to Melbourne lockdown, you've got an hour and a half before the curfew begins. And the rest of you look after yourself and try and avoid getting into a lockdown situation. So thank you all very much and good night.